morning, everybody. I hope you guys are all doing well. It's Brad Berzer for our final American Heritage class. Can you believe we've made it this far? After 15 weeks and a lot of chaos and lectures from the home office with all my Batman figures watching over us and making sure that I keep on the straight and narrow. But here we are, our final lecture, and I hope that it hasn't been as bizarre as it seems. So, I am truly sorry that we haven't been able to meet in person, but obviously there are things well beyond our control. And if you remember from the very beginning of class, I told you that this semester would get depressing and depressing and more depressing and more depressing, but then we'd end on a positive note. And I want this class to end on a positive note, but we still have to go through some depressing things before we get to that positive note. So I'm going to go through all that today, and we'll finish, though, on a note of victory, at least. If not a perfect note, it is one of victory. So that shouldn't be... Well, anyway, we'll get there, right? We'll get there in just a few moments. So once again, I hope you guys are all doing well. I hope that you're getting ready for the final. I have not yet sent out the study guide, and that is, well, I won't say it's unacceptable because we've still got well over a week before you have your final. But I will get that study guide to you, I hope. But I think I promised you this last week too. I hope that I will have it to you either today or tomorrow. And I will definitely do my best this afternoon to get that out to you. So I apologize for not having done that yet. That's entirely my fault, just getting caught up in things. So today we're going to talk about the end of socialism, or at least the end of socialism in its 20th century phase and what happens. And I would ask you guys to remember some of the things we've talked about, certainly when we were looking at Whittaker Chambers and Witness, when we were thinking about extreme forms of progressivism, and that progressive theory, which we've gone through several times. We spent 3 whole lectures dealing with progressivism and what that was. And I'd also like you to remember the Gulag scene from The Killing Fields. If you have not had a chance to watch that, I ask you to please watch that. Make sure that you watch that with detail, because that will in some way, in some form, appear on your final exam. So I want you to consider that a document that we're using in the class. But I want to turn for a moment, as we think about this final lecture, I want to turn to T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot in 1936 very famously wrote that if you will not have God, and he is a jealous God, you'd better pay your respects to either Stalin or Hitler. But he also wrote in the choruses to The Rock something that I have always found stunningly beautiful, if not really depressing, but stunningly beautiful, as a way to try to figure out what has happened in the 20th century. And this takes us back very much to Whittaker Chambers and to Witness, and that great divide between those who believe in God and those who believe in ideology, meaning those who believe in freedom and those who believe in tyranny. T.S. Eliot, in his Choruses from the Rock, one of his plays, has the chorus sing, "But it seems that something has happened that has never happened before, though we know not just when, or why, or how, or where. Men have left God, not for other gods they say, but for no God, and this has never happened before. That men both deny gods and worship gods, professing first reason, and then money and power and what they call life, or race, or dialectic. The church disowned, the tower overthrown, the bells upturned. What have we to do but to stand with empty hands and palms turned upwards in an age which advances progressively backwards?" I think that pretty much sums up progressivism. It has been, over 100 years, the most brutal ideology the world has ever seen. It has led to extreme racism, extreme nationalism, and the extreme loss of life. Whittaker Chambers, if you'll remember, said in his Witness, "Communism is not new. It is in fact man's second oldest faith. Its promise was whispered in the first days of creation under the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Ye shall be as gods. It is the great alternative faith of mankind. Like all great faiths, its force derives from a simple vision. Other ages have had great visions. They have always been different versions of the same vision, the vision of God and man's relationship to God. The communist vision is the vision of man without God. It is the vision of man's mind displacing God as the creative intelligence of the universe. So, what I'd like to talk about today are three people that I think are essential to understanding the goodness that will triumph for a while in the 20th century. And interestingly enough, we can divide them in three ways. There is a Roman Catholic, a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and a Protestant, which I find fascinating that we have the three great branches of Christianity represented. But we also have, in a strange way, a priest, a prophet, and a king. So I want to start with the prophet. And the great prophet of the 20th century was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who had written his Gulag through incredible difficulties because, of course, he was in the Gulag when he wrote his book, his 3-volume history of the Soviet prison camps. And in that Gulag, he describes exactly what happens to a person who is not killed immediately. In fact, one of the things that Solzhenitsyn, one of the points that he makes, is that those who were executed by the Soviets or the Nazis were basically the lucky ones, because at least you left this life with your soul intact. The worst was to be captured and then tortured so relentlessly that you gave up both your soul and ultimately your life. So it's far better just to lose your life than it is to lose your soul, than it is to lose your soul and your life. And Solzhenitsyn, towards the end of volume 1 of this 3-volume history, the Gulag, tells us that there are 10 things that all tyrannies try to do to the human soul. He says, number 1, there is always fear. Right? Everywhere there is an atmosphere of fear. Fear was not always the fear of arrest, he writes. There were immediate threats, the purges, the inspections, the completion of security questionnaires, routine or extraordinary ones, dismissal from work, deprivation of a resident permit, expulsion or exile. Number 2, there is always servitude, with internal papers, internal passports, legal prohibitions on buying and selling, renting. All of this was a way of making sure that the subject was always a servant to the state in one way or another. Number 3, that there is always secrecy and distrust. The universal mutual distrust had the effect of deepening the mass grave pit of slavery, Solzhenitsyn says. The moment someone began to speak up frankly, everyone stepped back and shunned him. A provocation. And therefore, anyone who burst out with a sincere protest was predestined to loneliness and to alienation. Number 4, universal ignorance. Because of number 1, no one could ever trust fully the information of another, or trust another with any information, and this resulted in the isolation of any true or right-thinking person, and therefore led to number 5, squealing, the reporting of one another, further eroding any trust that might exist, and without trust, civilization proves impossible. And therefore, number 6, betrayal becomes a norm. Sons betray fathers, daughters betray mothers, husbands betray wives, and supposed best friends betray one another. In fact, it was Solzhenitsyn's wife who turned him in to the KGB, reporting him for having had a correspondence with a German soldier after World War II. Number 7, corruption everywhere. As a result, Solzhenitsyn wrote, corruption becomes endemic in these totalitarian societies. For betrayers become professionals, and they earn positions, status, and wealth for their information, whether true or false, that they can report on another one. The informer becomes the great possessor of power within such a society. Number 8, everywhere there is the lie. The permanent lie becomes the only safe form of existence, Solzhenitsyn writes, in the same way as betrayal. Every wag of the tongue can be overheard by someone, every facial expression observed by someone. Therefore, every word, if it does not have to be a direct lie, is nonetheless obliged not to contradict the general, common lie. And there always exists a collection of ready-made phrases, of labels, a selection of ready-made lies. Number 9, in such a society, what could there ever be? Anything but cruelty. And where among all the preceding qualities was there any place left for kind-heartedness? How could one possibly preserve one's kindness while pushing away the hands of those who were drowning? Once you have been steeped in blood, you can only become more cruel. And when you add that kindness was ridiculed, that pity was ridiculed, that mercy was ridiculed, you'd never be able to chain all those who were drunk on the blood of the system. Right? The Nazis, the communists, the progressives, they're all vampiric. And what is this? This is number 10, a slave psychology meant to make men impotent. And so towards the very end of the Gulag, Solzhenitsyn writes poetically, but beautifully and disturbingly. Shut your eyes, gentle reader. Do you hear the thundering of the wheels? Those are the Stolpen cars rolling on and on. Those are the red cows rolling every minute of the day and every day of the year. And you can hear the water gurgling. Those are the prisoners' barges moving on, and the motors of the Black Marias roar. They are arresting someone all the time, cramming him in somewhere, moving him about. And what is that hum you hear? The overcrowded cells of the transit prisons, and that cry, the complaints of those who have been plundered, raped, and beaten to within an inch of their lives. We have reviewed and considered all the methods of delivering prisoners, and we have found that they are all worse. We have examined the transit prisons, but we have not found any that were good. And even the last human hope that there is something better ahead, that it will be better in camp, is a false hope. For in camp, it will be worse. Right? And there's Solzhenitsyn, the man who lived and survived in a progressive communist regime and was able to get the truth out, but only at great expense to not only his allies, but also to his own reputation within the Soviet Union. And he had to end up hiding in New England, in America, for a very long period of his life before the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I don't want you to think that Solzhenitsyn is merely an anti-communist. When he comes to America, he also warns the West that we too are going down the path of totalitarianism, but we were doing it in the way that de Tocqueville warned. We are doing it through a soft rather than a hard despotism. And he says in 1978 to the graduating class at Harvard that we have all been dragged along the whole of the Western bourgeois industrial and Marxist path. Right? Two ways of getting to the same place. One a hard tyranny, the other a soft tyranny. A dozen maggots can't go on and on gnawing the same apple forever. That if the earth is a finite object, then its expanses and resources are finite also. And the endless, infinite progress dinned into our heads by the dreamers of the Enlightenment cannot be accomplished on it. All that endless progress has turned out to be an insane, ill-considered, furious dash into a blind alley. For a civilization greedy for perpetual progress has now choked and is on its last legs. And then again, in 1983, in his famous Templeton address, Solzhenitsyn said, "Our life consists not in the pursuit of material success, but in the quest of worthy spiritual growth. Our entire earthly existence is but a transition stage in the movement towards something higher, and we must not stumble or fall, nor must we linger fruitless on one rung of the ladder. The laws of physics and physiology will never reveal the indisputable manner in which the Creator constantly, day in and day out, participates in the life of each of us, unfailingly granting us the energy, the grace of existence. Right? Remember Burke, the unbought grace of life. And when this divine assistance leaves us, we die. In the life of our entire planet, the divine spirit moves with no less force. This we must grasp in our dark and terrible hour. Right? That is the essence of life, that unbought grace of life. Solzhenitsyn and Burke both remind us. It's not about progress. It's not about progressivism. It's not about moving anywhere in this world, though of course we must always, through charity, alleviate the pains of the poor and the oppressed. That is without question. That is a duty through charity. But we must also recognize that life is not merely about the piling on of life after life after life. It is about having a worthy goal and living for something that gives us purpose and meaning, and we need to seek for a very, very, very good meaning. And so I turn from the prophet to the priest, a man by the name of Karol Wojtyla, a Pole who becomes first a member of the anti-Nazi underground and then a member of the anti-communist underground, a man who is an absolute genius of language, who is a philosopher and a playwright, a man who carried a Jewish woman over 200 miles on his back to make sure that she could escape from Nazi tyranny, a man who becomes the great Bishop of Krakow in 1958 and then is elected Pope John Paul II in 1978. John Paul II, having grown up as an anti-Nazi and an anti-communist, understood tyranny better than almost any of us ever could. Even more than Solzhenitsyn, who had only grown up under the progressivism of the communists. Here we have a man who grew up under the progressivism of the Nazis and the communists, and he understood fully well what that progress could do and the horrors that it could create and the men and the women that it would slaughter. John Paul II, in the first year of his pontificate, went back to Poland in the summer of 1979, and when he did, he drew some of the largest crowds the world had ever seen. And he told the people of Poland they must do two things. They must first follow the example of the great Polish martyr, Saint Stanislaus. Saint Stanislaus had been the friend of the king, but had recognized, this is in the late medieval period, had recognized that some of the actions of the king were immoral. When Stanislaus challenged his friend and the king about this, the king had him murdered and executed. So, here we have John Paul II in 1979 saying, be like that guy, Saint Stanislaus. And then he says, and I will give you another example, the story of another great Pole that you must follow. And this is the story of a Pole that many people would have known because it was still within their lifetimes and their memories. And this is the story of this other great Pole. On the last day of July, 1941, in Auschwitz, someone had attempted to escape, and the Nazi punishment was to call randomly 10 other prisoners to be executed to make up for the one who had escaped. And one of the persons who was called, and of course these guys were all innocent, they were called randomly, one of the prisoners was prisoner 5659, who had been interned in the Nazi camp in Auschwitz with his family. And as they were calling the numbers, prisoner 16670 raised his hand and volunteered to take the place of prisoner 5659. This had never been done before in Auschwitz, and the Nazi commandant was at a loss for what to do, but trying to save face, he allowed prisoner 16670 to take the place of prisoner 5659. And to punish these men, the commandant ordered that all 10 of the men be placed into cell block 13. Now, at this point in Nazi history, the vast mass killing of the gas chambers and the ovens had not yet been implemented. Those would be implemented in 1942. This is still July and August of 1941. Auschwitz is still absolute hell on earth, but there was not the mass killing that the progressives would be famous for within a year of this. And so 10 men were stripped naked and they were put into cell block 13. Cell block 13 is, and you can't see my office, but cell block 13 is only about the size of my office here. And it's only about 3.5 foot high. It's a concrete bunker. There is no water inside. There is no food inside. There are no toilets inside. And so to strip these men naked and then to put them into cell block 13, the goal was to drive them mad. And remember what Solzhenitsyn said, it is better to be executed than it is to be tortured, because in that torture you can lose both your soul and your life. So the Nazis put all 10 of these men into cell block 13, and they were denied food, they were denied water, and the idea, they were also denied sunlight. It was sealed. And so the only thing they had was air in each other. And the Nazis, of course, wanted them not only to go mad in there, but to eat each other and to be cannibals, to lose their souls. And on August 14th, the Nazis opened up this cell. And this has been now 2 weeks that these guys have been in there. And when they open up the cell, they find everyone is in terrible shape, but there's been no cannibalism. Prisoner 16670, a man by the name of Maximilian Kolbe, who was a priest, had been preaching to these men the entire 2 weeks, as far as we know. And the Nazi commandant was so upset that his plan had failed, that he ordered the injecting of each of the men with carbolic acid, which would freeze the body and kill them instantly. And when one of the Nazis was ordered to go in and clean up the bodies, this is what he reports as he walked in, or crawled in to this space to drag out the bodies. There was Maximilian Kolbe. This was under court testimony. This is under oath. This person said that when he went in, he was stunned at what he found. When I opened the iron door, Father Kolbe was no longer alive, but his face had an unusual radiance about it. The eyes were wide open and focused on some definite point, and his entire person seemed to have been in a state of ecstasy. I will never forget this scene as long as I live. And there was Kolbe, emaciated, but he held out his hand to the captor and allowed the captor to inject him with carbolic acid. How do you explain something like this? So, what does John Paul II say? Live like St. Stanislaus. Live and die like Maximilian Kolbe. And he takes from Scripture, how appropriately from the Easter season, he says, your motto must be not afraid. And never under any circumstances, ever, may you take up the arts and the weapons of the enemy, because the moment you do so, you become the enemy. In other words, you're going to have to fight the progressive tyranny of the communists, but you have to do so through utterly humane and peaceful methods. You must fight as Christ fought, by offering himself to the world. John Paul II said of Auschwitz, it was a Golgotha. It was the Golgotha of the modern world. It was built on the negation of faith. It was built on the negation of faith in God and faith in man. It was meant to trample radically, not only on love, but on all signs of human dignity and humanity. It was built on hatred and contempt for man in the name of a crazed ideology. We can only conquer evil and have victory through faith and through love. And so John Paul II becomes, in many ways, the great enemy of the communists. And they attempt to assassinate him in 1981, and a bullet misses his heart by only a mere millimeter as an assassin tries to take him out. It's quite stunning. In every way, it's quite stunning. Okay, so we'll turn to the third figure, the king, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is one of the three greatest presidents in American history. In order, it would go George Washington, and then Abraham Lincoln, and then Ronald Reagan. Reagan is the man who overcame Soviet tyranny, but only in alliance with John Paul II, and to a lesser degree with men such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I want to read to you from something that I had the great privilege of seeing in 1981. So I have to give you a little bit of my own background. You guys all know, and I've told you a million times, I was born in 1967. And so in 1980, I turned 13. At the end of 1980, I turned 13, and Ronald Reagan was elected president right after my 13th birthday. And then someone in his first administration, in fact, within the first 2 months of his administration, a guy by the name of John Hinckley, a very unhinged, crazy man who was trying to impress the actress Jodie Foster, attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan. And I'll never forget when my middle school principal, actually we called it junior high then, but my junior high principal, 7th grade, came on the speaker and told us that President Reagan had been killed. He was not killed, but everybody thought so for quite a while. Reagan took a bullet, and that bullet, just like the one that barely missed killing John Paul II, barely missed killing Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan took this with absolute grace, and he went from being a popular man to being an extremely popular and kind of mythic figure in America. It was almost impossible to dislike Reagan after he took the bullet. There's a great moment where after the bullet is shot, after he is shot, after the bullet's fired, and he is rushed to the hospital, he wakes up for a moment in the hospital. This is in March of 1981. He wakes up and he looks at the doctors and he says, "I'm really praying that none of you are Democrats." It's funny. It was a great moment. And after all of this, he would walk to the window in the hospital and he would wave to huge crowds of people who were there to wish him well. And it's incredible. And so his very first public appearance after the assassination attempt was on May 17th of 1981, and it was at the University of Notre Dame. I was there. I was only 13, but my oldest brother was a member of the graduating class of 1981. And so I got to see Ronald Reagan give this speech, and it was one of the greatest moments of my life. I still, my wallet's downstairs on top of the refrigerator, but I still carry it with me everywhere. I still have my ticket. I laminated it. I never go anywhere without my Ronald Reagan ticket, and I've had that since May 17th of 1981. I suppose there's a bit of superstition in it, but it's my relic that I keep with me. And this speech that Reagan gave was a stunning speech. I'm only going to read a little bit to you, but you'll get the essence. And Reagan wrote this, by the way. He didn't have a speechwriter write this. He wrote this. And he wanted this to be a special speech. It had to be a special speech. It had to explain his presidency. So this is what he says towards the end of it. And remember, he's speaking to college seniors, 20, 21-year-olds, not much older than you guys, in 1981. And we've just come out of a terrible, and we're still in it actually at that point, terrible recession. The world had really gone to hell. The Soviets had expanded into Afghanistan, into Latin America, into Angola and Mozambique and Africa. It looked bad. We had hostages that were still prisoners in Iran. Things looked grim in 1981. Even with a new president, they looked really grim. This is what Reagan says. The years ahead are great ones for this country, for the cause of freedom and the spread of civilization. The West will no longer contain communism. It will transcend communism. It won't bother to denounce communism. It will dismiss it as some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written. I think you have to take the context here. Remember what we just talked about. Every president, from Truman to Eisenhower to John F. Kennedy to Lyndon Johnson to Richard Nixon to Gerald Ford to Carter, all of them had embraced a materialist philosophy, one of containment, that said we would not roll back the Soviets, but we would not let them expand anywhere. Well, that policy had failed miserably. The Soviets had expanded everywhere. It was a failure of a policy, and Ronald Reagan knew exactly why. It failed because it was based on the wrong thing. The strength of America, the strength of Western civilization, is not the strength of building stuff. That's crazy. That's a fringe benefit. The strength of America and the strength of Western civilization is that we believe in something higher than ourselves. We believe in God. And God is the source. And God is the strength. And it is through God that we enjoy the unbought grace of life. We will no longer contain communism. We will transcend it. William Faulkner, at a Nobel Prize ceremony some time back, said, "Man would not merely endure, he would prevail against the modern world, because he will return to the old verities and truths of the heart." And then Faulkner said of man, "He is immortal because he alone among creatures has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance." Now, when I hear people talk, and I'm Brad now, I'm not reading from Reagan, but when I hear people say that conservatives are greedy and selfish and only about the material pursuits of the strong, I cringe with every fiber of my being, because to me, conservatism is about compassion and sacrifice and endurance. Reagan said it right here in 1981. And one, Reagan continues, can never say those words, compassion, sacrifice, or endurance, without thinking of the irony that the one who so exemplifies them, John Paul II, a man of peace and goodness and inspiration to the world, could be struck by a bullet from a man towards whom he could feel only compassion and love. It was Pope John Paul II who warned in last year's encyclical on mercy and justice against certain economic theories that use the rhetoric of class struggle to justify injustice. He said, in the name of an alleged justice, the neighbor is sometimes destroyed, killed, or deprived of his liberty, or stripped of his fundamental human rights. For the West, for America, Reagan continues, the time has come to dare to show the world that our civilized ideas, our traditions, our values are not like the ideology and war machine of totalitarian societies, merely a facade of strength. It is time for the world to know that our spiritual and intellectual values are rooted in the source of all strength, a belief in a supreme being with a law higher than our own. It is not enough to hate the Nazis. It is not enough to hate the communists. We must love humanity. We must love charity. We must love compassion. We must love sacrifice, and we must love endurance for the right things. One of my favorite pieces of art that came out of the post-communist world was an image of George Washington The same image that we've seen a million times, Washington after the French and Indian War. But there's something subtly different in this picture. When you look down, in one hand, Washington holds the head of Stalin, and in the other hand, he holds the head of Hitler. The two horrible progressives of this century. And Washington is the victor. And the name of this is called victory. And that is the only way we will ever defeat progressive tyranny, is if we believe in something, and that something has to be into the dignity and the uniqueness of the human person. Alexander Solzhenitsyn understood that. John Paul II understood that. Ronald Reagan understood that. We must defend the rights of the oppressed. We must defend the rights of all those who are abused and harmed. That is the great lesson of Western civilization and of history. And if you guys have wondered, why do we teach you everything from the Socratic ethic of never doing wrong, no matter the excuse, all the way up to the fall of communism in 1989? Why do we teach all of this? Because we're really trying to get across one thing. Every human person matters. God makes nothing in vain. God does not waste his time or his energy on fruitless or worthless things. He believes and he loves and he encourages and he nourishes, and we must do the same to one another. I will repeat again what Reagan said. For the West and for America, the time has come to dare to show the world that our civilized ideals, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, that our traditions, the whole tradition of the dignity of the human person, our values, every single person matters, are not, like the ideology and war machine of totalitarian societies, just a facade of strength. It is time for the world to know that our intellectual and spiritual values are rooted in the source of all strength, a belief in the supreme being, a law higher than our own. Because, Reagan continues, when it is written, the history of our time will not dwell long on the hardships of the recent past, but history will ask, and our answer will determine the fate of freedom for 1,000 years. Did a nation born of hope lose hope? Did a people forged by courage find courage wanting? And did a generation steeled by hard war and a harsh peace forsake honor at the moment of a great climactic struggle for the human spirit? It's not about stuff. One of the greatest things we Americans are able to do is produce, and by producing, we are able to make lives better. We are able to increase the standard of life. We are able to increase longevity. We are able to decrease infant mortality. All of those things are great, but they are mere fringe benefits to the cause of those things. And the cause of those things is treating one another morally and with dignity, and not seeing another person like the progressives do as a means to an end, but seeing each and every person as an end in and of herself or himself. That is what we have to struggle with. And again, it is not enough to be against something. We must believe in something. And I realize that at some point, some of the things that we say over and over again become trite. But we have to believe in the good, the true, and the beautiful. We have to believe in the dignity of the human person. We also have to believe that life is worth something. So every time you guys walk by that statue in between Lane and Kendall, every time you see that Civil War statue, don't ever forget that Hillsdale men lined up, volunteered on day one to fight against an evil, to fight against slavery, to fight against that indignity, and to fight against that inhumanity. That's what Hillsdale conserves. We conserve that element of the past, and we have to promote it as well. So, I want nothing more than for all of you to be successful in your careers. But I want even more for you to be successful in your souls. I fall down all the time, and it's only by the grace of God that I get back up. It is by the grace of God that we teach what we are able to teach, and it will be only by the grace of God that we continue to teach what we teach. But we have exemplars. We have people like Solzhenitsyn. We have people like John Paul II. And we have people like Ronald Reagan who remind us what it means to fight no matter the cost and to fight for what matters most in life. May we never, ever give up that fight. And may we always remember what needs to be remembered in our Western and our American heritage. God bless everybody.